Berserk is an extremely rich manga. Whether it's the work itself or everything that surrounds it, there's so much to analyze, so many different subjects to tackle, and so many different ways of dealing with them, that anyone who really wants to delve into an in-depth analysis of this manga will find themselves caught up in a certain vertigo, not really knowing where to start or what to do. And that's what happened to me. Berserk is my favorite work in all mediums, and if ever there was a work I wanted to talk about on this channel, it's this one. After spending 2 years making videos on other subjects to gain experience and subscribers, I thought it was time to tackle the huge chunk that is Berserk. In several videos of course, but where to start? In fact, once you take a step back, you soon realize that one element is at the very heart of the plot. So much so that the entire universe created by Kentaro Miura revolves around it. And that from this element stems one of the most important philosophical questions of the entire manga, if not the manga's central question. In short, we're going to talk about causality and all the questions it raises. Everything comes down to causality. Causality, like the word destiny, which often serves as a synonym for it, comes up again and again at key moments in the Berserk story, mainly from the mouths of Void and the Skull Knight. So, what is causality? Well, I'd better warn you in advance, I'm going to have to give a long philosophical scientific explanation full of digressions, while doing my best to popularize all this in a concise way, knowing that for some people I might be saying obvious things as well, but I assure you that all this part is relevant to the rest of the video, and that it's not just intellectual wank. First of all, as the name suggests, this term is linked to the principle of causality, the relationship between cause and effect. This principle simply states that each event, each cause, contributes to the production of another event, the effect, which is the consequence of the first, and that in the end, everything that exists, everything that is the result of a chain of cause and effect. The example often used to explain this principle is that of the domino. When you drop dominoes, if you're not too bad, you only need to push the first domino to make all the others fall, because each domino will fall because of the fall of the previous domino, and each fall of a domino will have the effect of making the next one fall. Well, except for the last one. In the end, from the moment you pushed the first domino, the other dominoes could only fall. Their fall was inevitable, it was determined. And that's where the name of the philosophical notion based on this principle of causality comes from, determinism. And by the way, this principle is not limited to basic examples based on inert objects like dominoes. Everything you do is the result of a chain of cause and effect. If you're listening to me blather on about what must seem obvious to many of you, despite the fact that you just wanted to hear me talk about Berserk, it may be because you've subscribed to the channel and turned on the notifications. If you've subscribed to the channel, it may be because you've seen my magnificent videos on Chainsaw Man, and if you've seen these videos, it may be because you came across my incredible video on Hunter x Hunter, thanks to YouTube recommendations. Well, you get the idea. In short, nothing happens without a cause, nothing comes out of nowhere. We can always find, in theory at least, a logical explanation for an event. Of course, it's impossible to know all the causes of all the effects, but that doesn't call determinism into question. If we can't trace the causal chain of an event, it's simply because there are causes we don't know about, or that are too numerous and complex to take into account. It's a bit like chaos theory, which shows us that in many dynamic systems, tiny changes in initial conditions lead to rapidly divergent evolutions, making any long-term prediction impossible, as with the example of the double pendulum. But all it would take is an intelligence capable of taking all causes into account down to the smallest detail to predict what seemed unpredictable, and it could even know the future and past of the entire universe. This is where the Laplace demon thought experiment comes from, which I've already mentioned in the lore video on Guides for Tower of God, by the way. Pierre-Simon Laplace, in his philosophical essay on probabilities, an intelligence which, at a given moment, knew all the forces with which nature is animated, and the respective situations of the beings which compose it, if moreover it were sufficiently vast to submit these data to analysis, would embrace in the same formula the movements of the largest bodies in the universe and those of the lightest atom. Nothing would be uncertain for it, and the future, like the past, would be present to its eyes. Because indeed, we live in a world where everything, including us, is made up of particles that interact with each other according to the immutable laws of physics, thus following that eternal law of causality. And so in essence, since everything is nothing but particles interacting logically, everything is already decided, from the fall of dominoes to the slightest of your thoughts, everything is determined. And this has consequences for other major philosophical questions, such as the question of free will. In a determined world, where only the law of causality reigns, can we consider that we have free will? Well, absolutely not, since even our thoughts are only the result of causes and consequences over which we have no full control. You didn't choose the education your parents gave you, which shaped your way of thinking. Your personality has been unwittingly influenced by all the people you've met in your life, by all your experiences, everything you've lived through. So, not for a single moment have you really thought by yourself. All your thoughts have been influenced by a ton of factors that you can't control anyway. And that's what causality is all about in Berserk, the absence of free will in a determined world. But this definition is still incomplete, in fact, and I'll have to digress one last time to bring up the final problem posed by determinism, that of the existence of God. Indeed, although the fact that the world is determined or not doesn't prove the existence or non-existence of God, it's more comfortable to defend the idea of God's existence in a deterministic world, since, if the world is determined, it's perhaps because a superior omniscient entity created it, and therefore knew everything that would follow, a bit like Laplace's demon creator, a bit like God in fact. Whereas in an indeterminate world, God would no longer have control over the world, he could not foresee its evolution, he would no longer be totally omniscient. This is a debate that has greatly agitated the greatest scientists in history, and the most famous case is surely that of the famous debate between Albert Einstein and Niels Bohr over the principle of superposition in quantum mechanics, which basically, to put it very simply, implies the notion of probability, of chance. And not a kind of chance whose outcome could be predicted by a Laplace demon, like a throw of the dice for example, but a real, unpredictable chance, the consequence of which would be to make our world an indeterminate one. And the whole debate between Einstein and Bohr hinged on whether or not this probabilistic aspect of quantum mechanics really existed, as well as the loss of locality, but we won't go into that now. Einstein was convinced that there was no such thing as chance, that this probability was only apparent and that the theory was incomplete because according to him, God doesn't play dice, to which Bohr replied, "But who are you to tell God what to do?" Anyway, I really recommend you take an interest in this whole story. It's really fascinating from a scientific, historical and philosophical point of view. But if I've allowed myself this digression, it's to bring the question back to Berserk. If the world of Berserk is determined by causality, is there a higher force, a god in charge of all this, controlling causality at will? And if he exists, does he play dice? Does he leave room for a little chance? Is there a degree of indeterminacy in the world of Berserk? Is there any way to escape causality? The world of Berserk extends not only in width and length, but also in depth. There are three overlapping realities. There's the physical real world, where the characters live. Then there's the astral world, where supernatural creatures live and spirits wander, unaware of their death. And it's when the physical world overlaps with the astral world that we find ourselves in a place called the interstice, or threshold, and that creatures from the astral world can take shape in the real world, such as elves or trolls. It's in this interstice that Guts and Casca constantly live because of the cursed mark imposed on them during the eclipse, but it's also where the Clifford, Flora's house, and all other such places are located. And by the way, since volume 35 and the start of the Fantasia arc, the interstice has become the new reality, as the astral world and the real world have completely blended. But that's not the point. Finally, there's the world of idea, the world of souls, which lies at the source of life and where they go when they die, and where we find the God Hand. This world can only be superimposed under a single condition, during occultations or eclipses if you prefer. This place where the world of idea overlaps the real world is called the Nexus, and it's only here that the God Hand can be seen materializing. However, since the real and astral worlds have blended, the God Hand will most likely be able to materialize much more easily, which is suggested a bit at the end of volume 35, with the 4 panels of the other God Hand. Deeper still is the vortex, where the astral and idea worlds are superimposed, and where all souls mix after death. But if we continue to plunge even deeper into the heart of this vortex, into the abyss, then at last we'll find idea, the idea of evil, the desired god, the true master who controls this famous causality. And now we're going to have to talk about the famous chapter 83, which was pre-published in Young Animal at the time, but which Miura wished to withdraw from the manga at the time of publication, judging that it revealed too much about the story and that his universe would lose some of its mystery. As a result, the content of this chapter is not canon, as if it didn't exist at all. However, it is interesting to consider, not only because it reveals what Miura had in mind at this point in the story, but also because it's still not incoherent today, and that idea's name is mentioned several times, as is the presence of a superior being at the bottom of the abyss, who would control mankind's destiny. For example, it's Shirka who refers to the world of idea in his explanation of the different layers of reality, and we can also consider the title of the 3 chapters preceding Griffith's resurrection, Idea's Shadow. Finally, there's the end of chapter 82, where we see Griffith plunge into the abyss, where he sees Beherits rise up, as if heading towards their source, to finally end up facing a kind of giant heart and uttering the word God. Moreover, this story of ideas creation of the Beherits is practically confirmed by Flora, who tells us, a Beherit is the ultimate spiritual entity, dominating even the destiny of mankind, thus dominating causality. And then she tells us that they were brought into this world by a higher being, that in short, God, that is idea, created them before scattering them all over the world. Then finally she tells us that the destiny attached to it is in the hands of the one who created it, confirming at the same time that it is idea who controls the destiny or causality of these Beherits, which are above the fate of mankind. Finally, when Guts asks her about the God Hand, she replies, they have become the executors of the will of some presence deep in the abyss of the astral world. Anyway, all that to say that even without the deleted chapter, we can still roughly understand that a god sleeps in the deepest layer of reality and controls the causality, the destiny of men. But all becomes clearer when we read the famous deleted chapter. In this chapter, while we see Griffith in the midst of his transformation facing a giant heart at the very heart of the abyss, the latter introduces itself as idea, the desired god, the idea of evil. And where it gets really interesting is when idea explains his true nature. Idea is the materialization of the human ego, the embodiment of the collective consciousness of our species, a common consciousness deep within the soul of each individual transcending our individuality. It's this consciousness filled with violence, loneliness, and every kind of negative feeling that forms the vortex we call hell and which truly defines human nature. And it's this human nature that eventually created God, this higher will that transcends their individuality, that controls them. Humans wanted a cause, a meaning, pain, sadness, life, death. They wanted there to be a reason for it, a purpose, because otherwise it would all be meaningless and completely absurd. Being too weak to accept the meaninglessness behind their suffering and having no God to relate to, men, or rather their collective consciousness, created their own God. As Idea himself says, I created these causes because I was created for this. I control destiny. Obeying the essence of humanity, I weave the destiny of all humans. He explains to Griffith afterwards that everything has been prepared in advance by influencing the lowest levels of human consciousness to bring him to this place at this time. Whether it's the historical context or all the encounters he's had so far, everything was determined. As Void said during the eclipse, everything flows from causality, everything has been decided. So, causality is indeed a form of determinism controlled by a god, and reducing to nothing any possibility of free will for humanity. Well, yes and no. For at the end of this chapter, when Griffith asks Idea what he expects of him, Idea simply replies, be what you will be. As well as, do as you wish, you are the chosen one. In fact, Idea offers him free will, because in the end, Griffith, by losing his humanity, has become part of Idea, and Idea has become part of him. And this is where we finally understand the very nature of the God Hand, as well as their name. The God Hand are the only beings to whom Idea offers free will. And this is exactly what Void says to Griffith at the start of the eclipse, referring to him as the child blessed by causality, designated by the hand of the Almighty. And this is again what Void says to Griffith to convince him to sacrifice the Falcon Troop. If it is true that fate transcends human understanding and plays upon the lives of men, then it is within causality for man to accept the evil one and defy fate. In other words, man can only embrace evil to free himself from his destiny and regain his free will. It is Idea, the idea of evil, that has taken away man's free will, so he must become evil himself to regain it. In short, the God Hand are beings who have transcended themselves, who are probably able to see causality, that is, they are superior to the point of being able to take into account almost all causes and effects, and are therefore able to modify them as they wish, and therefore able to control causality. They are the ones who act for Idea, because they are part of him and he is part of them. They are literally the hand of God. So all bets are off? Guts definitely doesn't stand a chance against Griffith? Can he do nothing but dance in the palm of God's hand? Or is there any hope left? In fact, the question is put to us as early as Volume 5 and ultimately seems to be the main question the manga will seek to answer. Is there a higher law in this world that governs human destiny? A hand of God? Can men free themselves by their own will? It's clear from this sentence that even if Miura didn't know exactly where he was going at the time, he did know what Berserk's main question would be. Can men create their own destiny, be free, emancipate themselves from the God created out of their own weakness? I'm thinking, for example, of Flora, who defines destiny not as a circle but as a spiral. As if, even if everything is supposed to be determined, unforeseeable micro-changes could make things happen, and by accumulating, change the course of things, finally transforming the circle into a spiral, which ties in with what I was saying earlier about chaos theory and the double pendulum, and is in fact the very principle of the famous butterfly effect. Similarly, when the Skull Knight comes to save Guts from the eclipse, Ubik tells us, "You can't predict everything in the junctions of time, so strange things can happen." To which Slan replies, "No one can foresee the future entirely, because we are not divine in nature." Does this mean that even while being God's hand, even while being part of Him, idea remains far superior to them, or that idea itself is not actually divine in nature? If idea is a God created by men, then it's hardly surprising that he's an imperfect, fallible God who isn't truly omniscient, and therefore unable to truly grasp the totality of the causes and effects of the whole world, a sort of imperfect Laplace demon. And perhaps, just as the superposition principle of quantum physics has challenged the determinism of our world, the world of Berserk is not just the result of a chain of cause and effect. After all, the world of Berserk is a fantasy universe full of magic and things we don't understand, so there's no guarantee that it's a truly determined world, even if many things lead us to believe that it is. There's also the question of Griffith's individuality. Will he really act in accordance with idea? I'm not going to get into an analysis of Griffith, I'll save that for later. But one thing's for sure, all that matters to him is his dream. And his dream seems precisely in line with the will of idea, who seems to want nothing more than to let Griffith do whatever he wants, whether it brings pain or salvation to humans, as he puts it. But then, there's nothing to tell us that idea isn't manipulating Griffith, so the whole thing is vague enough to allow for a lot of theorizing, especially since we're relying on information from a chapter that isn't canon. Still, there's one key element which, for me, has a good chance of undermining this implacable causality on Griffith's side: the Moonchild, the child of Guts and Casca, corrupted by Griffith during the eclipse, and with whom he has shared his body since his resurrection. Indeed, if Griffith, by becoming God-hand, was able to acquire his free will, we can assume that the Moonchild too is unaffected by causality, since he shares his body. His actions could then completely change the situation, and even outside the full moon nights, when the Moonchild takes control of Griffith's body, he will influence it too. We saw this during the scene on Sword Hill in Volume 22, when Griffith decided to protect Casca when he would normally, by virtue of his God-hand nature, have remained unaffected. The fusion of Griffith and the child of Guts and Casca has ultimately created a kind of fallible, imperfect God-hand, and this could really change everything from the point of view of causality, while creating a loophole that Guts can exploit to defeat Griffith, who appeared to be truly invincible. What's more, making Casca's rape the key to Griffith's defeat would be narratively very powerful, I think, given what it triggered and the horror of the whole thing. But if there's one character who defies causality and seems to be at the heart of the famous question, can men free themselves by their own will? It's Guts. Already from birth he seemed destined to die, or rather to never be alive. You could also say that his survival is precisely the result of causality, but there's a line of Skull Knight dialogue that really puzzles me. On his very first appearance in the manga, in Volume 8, he says to Guts, "Take my words with you. You who refuse to submit, you who were born of a lifeless body, you whose life emerged from a putrid mire, you more intimate with death than anyone else, and above all more adept at escaping it." Beyond the fact that the Skull Knight knows how Guts was born, which is very disturbing, he also seems to treat him as someone a little out of the ordinary and will warn him of the coming eclipse. And we'll see later that he tries to protect him a little, especially when he saves him from the eclipse. It's unclear whether he's protecting him out of sympathy or to use him against causality perhaps. In any case, the eclipse is yet another example of a case where Guts shouldn't have survived, and neither should Casca, obviously. What's more, it's clear that Berserk's main narrative issue is whether he can defeat Griffith, in other words, defeat causality. Maybe it won't come from him directly, or maybe he'll manage through his own will to escape from this all-controlling hand of God, as suggested by the famous question in Volume 5, where we see a double-page spread of Guts pointing his Dragon Slayer at the sky as if he were the very symbol of this question or even its answer. If Guts fails, who else can do it? In fact, it's idea that determines everything, that creates the causes. But idea is born of human feelings, and humans have in a sense determined themselves, trading their freedom for a God who has created from scratch a meaning to their lives, a common goal. But since it was the collective human will that ultimately created causality, perhaps a strong will can oppose this determinism by opposing the collective human will. And that's what Guts is already doing. When we look at the inhabitants of Falconia, who represent the vast majority of people, and who blindly follow Griffith, seeing him as a godlike figure, they are for the most part the very representation of what created idea. And we see this very clearly with all his prophecies and dreams about the falcon that the inhabitants will make, who will become almost passive, quietly waiting for the falcon of light to come and save them. In fact, they were just waiting for the messiah of the god they themselves had created. As for Guts, he fights with a small group of people against Griffith, representing the opposite of the inhabitants of Falconia, the opposite of idea. And finally, from a symbolic point of view, we mustn't forget that idea, the idea of evil, was created by negative human feelings. Idea literally represents the dark side of humanity. He even more or less says in the deleted chapter that his existence is proof that humans are evil by nature. But if idea loses, if causality loses, if humans manage to detach themselves from it, wouldn't that mean that man isn't necessarily evil by nature? In other words, the question of free will conceals the question of human nature. If man is evil by nature, then he will lead himself to his own downfall, to the loss of his free will. But if this is not totally the case, then there is still hope for man to regain his freedom. We could also say that the question is also that of the quest for meaning. Idea was created because mankind could find no meaning in life, no meaning in suffering. But the meaning of this absurd life is something Guts has always sought, whether in the Golden Age, where the question of the meaning of his life, of why he always seeks to survive at all costs, is at the heart of his personal development and introspection, or in the rest of the manga, where he will always wonder whether his goal should be his revenge on Griffith, or the protection of Casca, hatred or love. In short, Guts, unlike the collective human will, is aware of the absurdity of the world and its apparent lack of meaning, but has not abandoned his personal quest for meaning, and it is perhaps precisely by finding meaning in his life that he will also differentiate himself from this collective will, from idea, and thus from causality. Finally, there's one last somewhat meta point to address regarding determinism in Berserk. For while idea is a god created by humans, there is a real god who controls everything behind the scenes. Well, there was one, unfortunately. I'm talking of course about Kentaro Miura, who created the whole story. After all, every author is the god of his work. But when you read his interviews and take a look at Kentaro Miura's writing style, you're more likely to find a gardener's style of writing than an architect's style. For those who don't know what I'm referring to, this is an appellation given to two completely opposite styles of writing. The architect is the writer who plans everything in advance, even before he begins his work, and who draws up all the plans for the house before building it. The best known examples are One Piece, Shingeki no Kyojin, Full Metal Alchemist, Tower of God, etc. The gardener is the author who doesn't plan anything in advance, and lets the story unfold logically according to the elements he created at the start, improvising as he goes along. He's the gardener who plants his seeds and watches them grow. I'm thinking more of Game of Thrones, Dragon Ball and so on. However, these categories are expressed more in percentage terms, you might say. There's always a lot of improvisation among architects, who can come up with new ideas while building the house. Just as there's planning among gardeners, who can prune their plants or force them to grow in the direction they want. But if we take Berserk, we're much closer to the gardener in my eyes. When Miura started Berserk with the Black Swordsman arc, he had no idea what he was going to do, apart from a story of revenge. He hadn't even written what Guts had gone through, and was even still hesitating between doing a historical manga and a dark fantasy manga. And even once he'd started the Golden Age, he did a lot of improvising. He didn't even know what role Casca would play when he introduced her in the manga. In my opinion, what makes him a great author is precisely the fact that he managed to create a coherent, deep and complex story by improvising on elements he'd already introduced. In short, all this to say that, even the way Miura wrote his manga, Berserk seemed indeterminate, at least in part. Moreover, now that Miura has passed away, and his best friend Koji Mori, to whom he shared the entire Berserk script, has taken over the manga, we can be sure that the story won't unfold exactly as it would have with Miura at the helm, and so nothing has ever really been determined. To conclude, if I had to summarize this video and at the same time attempt to sum up the story of Berserk, I'd say that Berserk tells us the story of a humanity which, abandoning the idea of finding meaning in the absurd world in which it lives, has preferred to exchange its free will for a god creating causes, a purpose, a meaning to their lives, and also the story of a man who, having not given up his quest for meaning, refuses to submit and fights to defy destiny, causality, and finally regain what this god created from scratch has taken from him: his free will, his freedom.